Paper 172. Going into Jerusalem. Jesus and the apostles arrived at Bethany shortly after 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, March 31, A.D. 30. Lazarus, his sisters, and their friends were expecting them, and since so many people came every day to talk with Lazarus about his resurrection, Jesus was informed that arrangements had been made for him to stay with a neighboring believer, one Simon, the leading citizen of the little village, since the death of Lazarus's father. That evening Jesus received many visitors, and the common folks of Bethany and Bethpage did their best to make him feel welcome. Although many thought Jesus was now going into Jerusalem in utter defiance of the Sanhedrin's decree of death, to proclaim himself King of the Jews, the Bethany family, Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, more fully realized that the Master was not that kind of a king. They dimly felt that this might be his last visit to Jerusalem and Bethany. The chief priests were informed that Jesus lodged at Bethany, but they thought best not to attempt to seize him among his friends. They decided to await his coming on into Jerusalem. Jesus knew all about this, but he was majestically calm. His friends had never seen him more composed and congenial. Even the apostles were astonished that he should be so unconcerned when the Sanhedrin had called upon all Jewry to deliver him into their hands. While the Master slept that night, the apostles watched over him by twos, and many of them were girded with swords. Early the next morning they were awakened by hundreds of pilgrims who came out from Jerusalem, even on the Sabbath day, to see Jesus and Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. 1. Sabbath at Bethany. Pilgrims from outside of Judea, as well as the Jewish authorities, had all been asking, "What do you think? Will Jesus come up to the feast?" Therefore, when the people heard that Jesus was at Bethany, they were glad, but the chief priests and Pharisees were somewhat perplexed. They were pleased to have him under their jurisdiction, but they were a trifle disconcerted by his boldness. They remembered that on his previous visit to Bethany, Lazarus had been raised from the dead, and Lazarus was becoming a big problem to the enemies of Jesus. 6 days before the Passover, on the evening after the Sabbath, all Bethany and Bethpage joined in celebrating the arrival of Jesus by a public banquet at the home of Simon. This supper was in honor of both Jesus and Lazarus. It was tendered in defiance of the Sanhedrin. Martha directed the serving of the food. Her sister Mary was among the women onlookers, as it was against the custom of the Jews for a woman to sit at a public banquet. The agents of the Sanhedrin were present, but they feared to apprehend Jesus in the midst of his friends. Jesus talked with Simon about Joshua of old, whose namesake he was, and recited how Joshua and the Israelites had come up to Jerusalem through Jericho. In commenting on the legend of the walls of Jericho falling down, Jesus said, "I am not concerned with such walls of brick and stone, but I would cause the walls of prejudice, self-righteousness, and hate to crumble before this preaching of the Father's love for all men." The banquet went along in a very cheerful and normal manner, except that all the apostles were unusually sober. Jesus was exceptionally cheerful, and had been playing with the children up to the time of coming to the table. Nothing out of the ordinary happened until near the close of the feasting, when Mary, the sister of Lazarus, stepped forward from among the group of women onlookers, and going up to where Jesus reclined as the guest of honor, proceeded to open a large alabaster cruse of very rare and costly ointment, and after anointing the Master's head, she began to pour it upon his feet as she took down her hair and wiped them with it. The whole house became filled with the odor of the ointment, and everybody present was amazed at what Mary had done. Lazarus said nothing, but when some of the people murmured, showing indignation that so costly an ointment should be thus used, Judas Iscariot stepped over to where Andrew reclined and said, "Why was this ointment not sold, and the money bestowed to feed the poor? You should speak to the Master that he rebuke such waste." Jesus, knowing what they thought, and hearing what they said, put his hand upon Mary's head as she knelt by his side, and, with a kindly expression upon his face, said, "Let her alone, every one of you. Why do you trouble her about this, seeing that she has done a good thing in her heart? To you who murmur and say that this ointment should have been sold and the money given to the poor, let me say that you have the poor always with you, so that you may minister to them at any time it seems good to you. But I shall not always be with you. I go soon to my Father. This woman has long saved this ointment for my body at its burial, and now that it has seemed good to her to make this anointing in anticipation of my death, she shall not be denied such satisfaction. In the doing of this, Mary has reproved all of you, in that by this act she evinces faith in what I have said about my death and ascension to my Father in heaven. This woman shall not be reproved for that which she has this night done. Rather do I say to you that in the ages to come, wherever this gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, what she has done will be spoken of in memory of her. It was because of this rebuke, which he took as a personal reproof, that Judas Iscariot finally made up his mind to seek revenge for his hurt feelings. Many times had he entertained such ideas subconsciously, but now he dared to think such wicked thoughts in his open and conscious mind. And many others encouraged him in this attitude, since the cost of this ointment was a sum equal to the earnings of one man for 1 year, enough to provide bread for 5,000 persons. But Mary loved Jesus. She had provided this precious ointment with which to embalm his body in death, for she believed his words when he forewarned them that he must die. And it was not to be denied her if she changed her mind and chose to bestow this offering upon the Master while he yet lived. Both Lazarus and Martha knew that Mary had long saved the money wherewith to buy this cruse of spikenard, and they heartily approved of her doing as her heart desired in such a matter, for they were well-to-do, and could easily afford to make such an offering. When the chief priests heard of this dinner in Bethany for Jesus and Lazarus, they began to take counsel among themselves as to what should be done with Lazarus, and presently they decided that Lazarus must also die. They rightly concluded that it would be useless to put Jesus to death if they permitted Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead, to live. 2. Sunday morning with the Apostles. On this Sunday morning, in Simon's beautiful garden, the Master called his 12 apostles around him and gave them their final instructions preparatory to entering Jerusalem. He told them that he would probably deliver many addresses and teach many lessons before returning to the Father, but advised the apostles to refrain from doing any public work during this Passover sojourn in Jerusalem. He instructed them to remain near him and to watch and pray. Jesus knew that many of his apostles and immediate followers even then carried swords concealed on their persons, but he made no reference to this fact. This morning's instructions embraced a brief review of their ministry from the day of their ordination near Capernaum down to this day, when they were preparing to enter Jerusalem. The apostles listened in silence. They asked no questions. Early that morning, David Zebedee had turned over to Judas the funds realized from the sale of the equipment of the Pella encampment, and Judas in turn had placed the greater part of this money in the hands of Simon, their host, for safekeeping in anticipation of the exigencies of their entry into Jerusalem. After the conference with the apostles, Jesus held converse with Lazarus and instructed him to avoid the sacrifice of his life to the vengefulness of the Sanhedrin. It was in obedience to this admonition that Lazarus a few days later fled to Philadelphia when the officers of the Sanhedrin sent men to arrest him. In a way, all of Jesus' followers sensed the impending crisis, but they were prevented from fully realizing its seriousness by the unusual cheerfulness and exceptional good humor of the Master. 3. The start for Jerusalem. Bethany was about 2 miles from the temple, and it was 1:30 that Sunday afternoon when Jesus made ready to start for Jerusalem. He had feelings of profound affection for Bethany and its simple people. Nazareth, Capernaum, and Jerusalem had rejected him, but Bethany had accepted him, had believed in him. And it was in this small village, where almost every man, woman, and child were believers, that he chose to perform the mightiest work of his earth bestowal, the resurrection of Lazarus. He did not raise Lazarus that the villagers might believe, but rather because they already believed. All morning Jesus had thought about his entry into Jerusalem. Heretofore he had always endeavored to suppress all public acclaim of him as the Messiah. But it was different now. He was nearing the end of his career in the flesh. His death had been decreed by the Sanhedrin, and no harm could come from allowing his disciples to give free expression to their feelings, just as might occur if he elected to make a formal and public entry into the city. Jesus did not decide to make this public entrance into Jerusalem as a